Hello, I'm Anne-Marie Craven and I'm part of the Oral History Project, which is looking at the members of the parks employees who joined up in the First World War and who very, very sadly lost their lives.
And I'm Jane Ng Bao-Ying, also with Anne-Marie on the same project. And today we're speaking with Sarah Gooch. Sarah, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Sarah Gooch, and I am the great-granddaughter of one of the employees who was sent off to war in the First World War. And that was Hori Tribe, who worked as a propagator in the Greenwich parks.
And today you've shared a whole series of letters. Could you give us some background around that?
Well, it's a whole series of letters that were sent back from the war between 1916 and 1917 by my great-grandfather to his wife Bessie, and some of them are written to his two sons as well. My grandfather, who was also Hori but known as Sonny, and his brother, who was called Arthur. And the letters were kept together in a collection by Bessie after Hori was killed, and at the time of his death, they should have been buried with his. Well, at the time of her death, they should have been buried with her. And my great aunt, Hori's youngest child, Ruby, forgot about them because she was so upset about her mother's death. Hid them in a cupboard, and then some years later told my dad about them and showed them to him. And my dad said he would look after them and started to try and put them into some sort of order. And then about 10 years ago, my son, who was then 12 years old, was doing a sort of personal family history project as part of his work at school. And we unearthed the letters and started to look at some of them in much more detail. And we transcribed about half a dozen, right from the very end of Hori's life, and one or two that we dipped into, I think, and some at the beginning. And then time ran out and I put them in the cupboard, as can happen. And then at the beginning of this year, I had to spend some time recovering from an operation, and it seemed the perfect thing to help me through my recuperation. And I got a fascinating insight into not just the history of the war, but a great lesson in geography at that time and the political history of that time, but also into the small details of the domestic lives of the family and the children who were left behind.
What kind of person did you get from the letters when you read about the way he wrote to his family, the way he wrote to his friends?
He was always writing about asking how the kiddies were, and he seemed to be a really warm and loving father. He was often asking about how they had all done at school, and if there had been good reports, he was telling them how proud he was and asking Bess to let them know. And it seemed that, yes, it would have made an enormous gap, I think, for that family, for them to have lost that father, not just during the uncertainty, but then as a permanent thing, because, as we know, he didn't come back from the war. There's one letter, I think, where the youngest daughter, who must have been about 4, had sent him a penny, and he had thanked her for the penny. So it's that he talks as well about them, the older boys riding the bicycle, and that he'd left behind, and he's very concerned that the spokes on the bicycle are sorted out so that it's not dangerous and nobody has an accident, and he wants to know about the boys' jobs and how they're getting on, and gives them advice. And I think one of the things he says to his son Arthur is it's always to work hard and never do anything that you wouldn't want your mother to know about, which I thought was a great piece of advice from a father to a son as he was starting his working life. Yeah.
Great. And I remember you also mentioning a bit about how involved he was as a father when he wrote to one of his sons about comparing himself with the other son.
Yes, he was. I think my grandfather, Hori Jr., known as Sonny, had a job doing something which was obviously I think more of a manual job outside. And indeed, that's how Hori started, working as a gardener, and then he became a propagator by the time he left the Royal Parks at nearly 40. His brother, Hori's Jr.'s younger brother, Arthur, was a couple of years younger than him, and he seems to have been more academic, and during the course of the letters we learn that Arthur has passed his school examinations and has managed to land himself a job with quite good prospects in an office. So he's sort of moved out of the the outdoors, and he's gone inside. But he writes to Arthur to tell him how proud he is, and that he must make sure that he still makes sure he does things outside and carries on his sport, and advises him to carry on with his learning in the summer when they have the optional classes in the evening, and to do subjects which will be of benefit to him. But he also writes to Hori Jr. In a separate letter to say he hopes he won't be comparing himself to Arthur, because in his father's opinion, he thinks he's actually got by far the best job to be working outside, and he tells them how healthy all the Irish boys in his London Irish regiment are, because they're actually outdoors, and actually that's the best way to be, and how important your health is. I think because of his love of gardening, he obviously had a fascination for plants, and one of the letters he talks about eating prickly pears, which were the fruit of the cactus, and in fact he actually gives the Latin name for it in one of the letters, and watermelons and things like that. But he also, in some of the last letters, he sent a piece of fern and some crocus petals, or some crocus flowers, which we still have, and they're dried and preserved, which he found from a well up near Jerusalem. And in the very last letter he sent a piece of rosemary which he cut from a monastery just outside Jerusalem, and with the significance of rosemary being for remembrance, to actually have that in the very last letter is more than poignant.
And that also goes back to sort of his background in the royal parks. Was that mentioned in the letters at all?
Yes, he does talk about the royal parks a lot, particularly all his colleagues, and I think as they're described in something else, actually the comrades as well, they described each other as, and he mentions many of them by name. There was one in particular, Mr. Linford, who I think must have been in management, and it talks about Mr. Linford and the girls, so I think that must have been some of the young women who worked in the office at the parks as well in some form, and it seemed that they were often sending things out to the people in the First World War. He often talks about being sent tobacco or newspapers, or in fact on one occasion a new pipe, because Hori was very much a pipe smoker, so he didn't like the rations of cigarettes. But no, he talks about the colleagues a lot and wants to know how they are, and he's very anxious that Bess has gone up to the park to personally thank them for their kindness to him.
And then moving on a bit to his description of the conditions that he was in, because that also featured quite heavily.
Yes, it's quite a mixture. He talks about the lack of food, which I think was quite different to the people that were in the campaigns in Europe, and how hungry he was and how thin he's got. So I think that was one of the things in terms of the conditions. He also, quite clearly, he was someone for whom personal hygiene was a really important thing, and he got very upset about quite often having lice and being, as he described, crummy, which I think was a colloquial term for being lousy at that time. And he's often asking Bess to send him some kind of sulphur ointment, which I think is to get rid of the lice. That was something of a great trouble to him. Other bits of it, he talks about some of the men he worked with and some of the officers. And one particular letter, he's been assigned to one regiment who are distributing rations around Macedonia, basically by mule overnight. But he was a loader, so he was helping to load all of this onto the donkeys and the mules to go out. And he talks about the officers being real gentlemen, and that the NCOs, or the non-commissioned officers, were just and fair. And he says that makes a big difference when men are treated as men and not as dogs. And he said, and the same can't be said for all of the officers. But where he was quite happy. He describes as well, I think in one particular letter, really poetically the scenery in Macedonia, although he didn't like it very much there. But it's the beautiful descriptions of the landscape, and he says about the clouds, or the mountains piercing the clouds, which is really, really quite poetic, I think, for a man who I think probably didn't have a huge school education. So.
There was also a bit about humour, so he did cartoons and drawings.
Yes, he sent a couple of little pictures home. I think it came about because he was actually, although they look like the humorous, I think he meant them quite seriously, because he sent one of himself marching through the desert, which I think, from what came back in one of Bess's letters, that the children had found funny. But he actually said it isn't a funny matter at all, having to march through the desert in that heat with boots on and your pith helmet and a backpack weighing 130 pounds. So they look as if they're a bit, because of the way they're written, look quite humorous, but I think they weren't meant to be. And another one he sent, which he wrote, or he drew, I think, when he was actually in Egypt, but it was referring back to when he was in Macedonia, of him being out, well, there were some chaps' feet coming out of the end of a tent, and loads of different insects and snakes and scorpions, which he calls pilgrims of the night, and says, in fact, there were far more than he could put in that picture.
We discussed previously that he talked a lot about his domestic life, about his hopes, but at the same time he didn't really focus that much on the battle itself, but there was a couple of letters towards the end.
There are a couple of letters, one which was the Battle of Beersheba, which took place at the end of November 1917, where there was a huge campaign. I think the battle went on for about 2 weeks, and he talks in a lot of detail about the hardship of that they used to march all night and fight all day, and some of them who were firing rifles would just be lying on the ground for 10 hours firing a rifle, which would be very hot, and they had one set of clothing which would be soaked in sweat, and then at night they would be really freezing cold because they had nothing else to change into. There's one little detail in that I loved, which is where he talks about carrying some sticks down his back and fighting with them down his back, and he sort of carried those over a distance of about 60 miles in the hope that he would manage to make himself a cup of tea. I just really hope he did, and I hope that cup of tea tasted marvellous.
And then moving from that, you mentioned quite vividly a moment of peace for him.
Yes, right at the end of his life he was in a monastery just outside Jerusalem on the hill opposite, and they were sent there for 2 days respite. This was just before the final push to liberate Jerusalem. And he talks about there being just all peacefulness all around, and how tranquil and serene it was inside the church service, but yet on the hills and all around outside, all you can hear is shelling, and it's that contrast between the two things, and those two things just being fighting with each other, really. So that, I think, was very difficult for him, and that's when he picked, in that last letter, he picked the piece of rosemary from outside the monastery, and that's the last letter there. So,
and I think one other thing that you highlighted that was interesting for you was the foretelling.
Yes, there are a couple of letters, and he says that although everybody wants it to be over and wants the war to be finished and can't wait to get home, he said none of them would actually want it to finish before peace had been properly achieved, because if it ended in some kind of stalemate, he said, something about he said, you can trust me that what will happen is that there will be a repeat of it in a few years' time, and those horrors will be even worse.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you. It's been lovely to talk to you today. Thank you.